The Hershey bar has sat in American checkout aisles for more than a century, a nickel's worth of milk chocolate that built a town. On the 7th of April, 1937, that town turned on itself. Loyal factory hands and dairy farmers from the surrounding fields took up baseball bats, billy clubs, and hammers, stormed their own chocolate plant, and beat the men sitting down inside it until bones broke and teeth scattered across the floor, the mob outnumbering the strikers 4-1. It was the model town, the famous one, the benevolent one, administering what one newspaper called an old-fashioned walloping to its own. Milton Snavely Hershey had raised that town from a cornfield. Paved streets, a bank, a trolley line, free schooling, parks, and rents no working family could complain of. He had no children. He would leave every share of it to a school for orphan boys, and he had built, brick by careful brick, a place where gratitude was the price of belonging. The man who would build that place was born into the opposite of it. Milton Snavely Hershey came into the world on the 13th of September, 1857, in a stone farmhouse in Derry Township, Pennsylvania, the son of a restless father and a devout Mennonite mother. His father, Henry Hershey, was a dreamer who chased one collapsing venture after another across the state and was, more often than not, somewhere else. His mother, Fanny, held what remained of the household together with the thrift and the iron discipline of her plain-sect upbringing. Formal schooling ended for the boy somewhere around the 4th grade. What he learned after that, he learned standing up, in other men's shops. At 14, he was apprenticed to a Lancaster confectioner, 4 years bent over copper kettles and marble cooling slabs, learning the precise temperature at which sugar turns and the instant it scorches. When the apprenticeship ended, he set out to make his own fortune, and for the better part of a decade that fortune refused him. His first candy shop, opened in Philadelphia with $150 borrowed from an aunt, swallowed 6 years of 18-hour days before he finally locked its door for the last time. He tried again in other cities and failed there as well. In Denver, working in another man's kitchen, he learned the one thing that would matter more than any recipe he ever wrote down, that fresh milk, worked into caramel, made a softer sweet that kept far longer on the shelf. The failures were not gentle ones. Landlords turned him out. Young Tufts once set his pushcart alight and sent his horse bolting down a Lancaster street. When he went looking for money to fund yet another attempt, no relative would lend it. None of them trusted his record, and the record did not deserve their trust. He scraped together loans instead, rented a warehouse that had once housed one of Thomas Edison's electric plants, and worked nights as a handyman and a traveling salesman to keep the gas lit, while his mother and his aunt sat wrapping caramels by hand at the bench. He was, by every outward measure, a man approaching 30 who had failed at the only trade he knew. He would spend the rest of his life making certain that the men who worked for him never had to live the way he had lived, and making just as certain that they never forgot who had spared them. Then, quietly, it turned. The caramels he made with fresh milk, sold first from a cart and then out of that borrowed warehouse, began to find buyers. An English importer tasted one and asked to carry them across the Atlantic, and a steady export trade followed him home. The enterprise he named the Lancaster Caramel Company grew with a speed that startled even him. By 1890, it employed more than 100 workers. Before long, it ran several plants, shipped its Crystal A caramels across the country and overseas to England, and had made Milton Hershey, after 20 years of ruin, a wealthy man at last. And having finally seized the thing he had chased for 2 decades, he set about giving it away. At the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893, before the great white fairgrounds and the largest crowd ever gathered in America to that point, Hershey had stopped at a working display of German chocolate-making machinery and recognized his future in it. He bought the equipment, installed it in the Lancaster plant, and began coating his caramels in chocolate. To his cousin, he delivered the prophecy that would define the rest of his life. Caramels are only a fad. Chocolate is a permanent thing. So, in 1900, when his chief competitor, the American Caramel Company, offered $1 million in cash for the caramel business, Hershey sold it without hesitation. He surrendered the factory, the machinery, the formulas, and the Crystal A trademark, and kept only the chocolate equipment and a conviction the rest of his trade considered foolish. He had let go of the sure thing because he had decided it was a passing taste, and staked $1 million on a delicacy that, until that moment, had belonged to the rich. What Hershey envisioned was not a finer chocolate for the few, but a cheaper one for the multitude, a 5-cent bar of milk chocolate, identical from one wrapper to the next, sold in every corner store and crossroads shop in the country. The trouble was that milk chocolate, in 1900, was very nearly a Swiss monopoly, its method a closely guarded secret, because milk is mostly water, and water turns molten chocolate grainy and spoiled. Hershey did not know the secret. He would spend years in an experimental plant failing to find it, pouring ruined batch after ruined batch into the gutter before he arrived at a process of his own. One final stretch of failure, undertaken by a man who had finally grown rich, in pursuit of a thing no one had asked him to make. To produce that bar at 5 cents, he would need oceans of fresh milk, and oceans of fresh milk meant dairy country, and dairy country meant land. And so the self-made man who had spent his life in other men's shops and other men's cities went looking for ground of his own, a wide stretch of Pennsylvania farmland where he could raise not merely a factory, but around it a whole community that he alone would design and govern. He found it in the cornfields of Derry Township, the same township in which he had been born. He was coming home, and he intended to build something the country had never quite seen, a utopia with a single owner, offered to its people as a gift. What he built from nothing, and he built it as a single thought. Most American towns accrete over generations, a mill, then a church, then a tavern, then a grid of streets laid down by whoever arrives next. Hershey's town arrived all at once, drawn in pen and ink across a map of land he had quietly been buying for 2 years. Before he broke ground, he had pieced together more than 1,200 acres of Derry Township farmland, parcel by parcel, through a local real estate broker, until the dairy pasture east of Harrisburg had become, on paper, a blank page large enough to hold a vision. On that map, laid over the colored outlines of his purchases, he sketched the thing entire, the chocolate factory, the residential streets, a car barn, and tracks for a trolley system that did not yet exist, a schoolhouse, a park. He was not designing a factory with houses near it. He was designing a world. In March of 1903, he broke ground for the factory in the middle of the cornfields beside the small crossroads of Derry Church, a place of a tavern, a railroad station, a Presbyterian church, a grain mill, and a scattering of houses along Derry Road. By 1905, the plant was running, and the world he had drawn began to rise around it in limestone and brick. The residential streets went in on the south side of the avenue he named Chocolate, and he named the others for the places where cacao grew: Cocoa Avenue, Caracas, Granada, Trinidad. The houses were not the identical clapboard rows of the ordinary company town. Hershey varied their designs deliberately, gave them lawns and sidewalks and shade trees, and sold or rented them to his workers at prices a factory hand could actually meet. A man could raise a family on Cocoa Avenue in a house finer than anything his wages should have bought him, and the town supplied everything else as well. Hershey built it a public school system and, in time, free education that ran clear through junior college. He laid out a park for his workers, opened within a few years of the factory. He gave the town its own water company, its own electric company, its own telephone exchange, its own department store, and its own bank, the Hershey Trust Company, chartered in 1905 to hold the residents' savings and write their mortgages. He built the trolley line he had drawn on the map and subsidized its fares, so that a worker could ride out of Hershey to shop or to live in the towns beyond it. In 1906, the crossroads of Derry Church was renamed simply Hershey. The chocolate had built the town, and now the town wore the chocolate's name. To the visitor it was a marvel, and to much of the country it became one Chocolate Town, the clean and ordered answer to the soot and squalor of the industrial age. Above his desk, Hershey kept a sign that announced the governing principle of the whole enterprise: business is a matter of human service. He appears to have meant it. He had grown up poor in a family that came apart around an absent father, and he built for his workers the security he himself had never known. The paved street, the sound house, the good school, the band concert in the park on a summer evening. The industrialists of his age more often ruled their company towns through the ledger of the company store and the threat of eviction. Hershey ruled his through abundance, and believed, with some justice, that abundance made him a finer sort of master. But it was mastery all the same. The water that ran from the tap was Hershey's water. The current in the wires was Hershey's current. The streetcar, the telephone line, the department store, the bank that held a worker's savings, and the deed to his house. All of it traced back to one man and to one man's company. A town built as a gift was also a town in which a single owner held the water, the power, the rails, the schoolroom, and the roof over every family's head. The benevolence was genuine. So was the fact that nothing in Hershey, Pennsylvania, lay beyond the reach of the man whose name it carried. The service ran in one direction. The gratitude was expected to run in the other. For 3 decades the arrangement held because the town kept growing and the work never stopped, and a man who is being fed rarely examines the hand that feeds him. The question of what such a place would do if its people ever turned against the owner who had given them everything would not be asked for another 30 years. And when it was finally asked, it would be answered with baseball bats. For now the town was young and grateful and whole, and its founder had built, by any measure the age could supply, a success without precedent. He had built everything a man could build. He had not been able to build the one thing he wanted most, a child to inherit it. And the absence at the center of all that abundance, the empty nursery and the mansion on the hill, would do more to determine the fate of the fortune than any factory or street or trolley line he ever laid. For that, the answer lay with the woman who had married him in 1898. Her name was Catherine. She had come from nothing, too, which may be why he understood her. Catherine Elizabeth Sweeney was born on the 6th of July, 1871, in Jamestown, New York, the eldest daughter of Irish Catholic immigrants, her father from County Cork, her mother from County Clare. She left high school in her senior year to go to work and help support the family, and she made her living as a shop girl, charming customers across the counter of a Jamestown jewelry store with a wit and a warmth that people remembered for the rest of their lives. It was in Jamestown that Milton Hershey, passing through to sell his caramels, first saw her. What followed was an improbable courtship and a still less likely match. He was a Mennonite-raised confectioner of 40, plain in his habits and prominent in Lancaster. She was a Catholic shop girl of 26, fond of travel and of outrageous hats. He was never one for letters, so he wooed her by telegram and by candy and by flowers, even after she moved to New York City to sell ribbons behind the counter at Altman's department store. On the 25th of May, 1898, they were married, quietly, in the rectory of St. Patrick's Cathedral, because a Mennonite groom and an Irish Catholic bride could not be wed at the altar itself. He told almost no one beforehand. His own cousin would recall that Lancaster was astonished he had married her, and astonished, frankly, that he had married at all. She was the making of him in ways the chocolate never was. Kitty enlarged a narrow man. She traveled, she furnished, she planted, she gave. In Lancaster, she joined the Charity Society and spent her time among the poor families of the city, and it was she, by nearly every account, who turned her husband's mind toward giving his money away rather than merely making more of it. When he built his town in the cornfields, he built her a mansion above it, High Point, designed by the Lancaster architect C. Emlyn Urban, the same hand that had drawn the chocolate factory. And from its windows Kitty looked down on the streets her husband owned and the gardens she herself had planted. Her great gift to Hershey, Pennsylvania, was its landscaping. The trees and the lawns that made the model town beautiful were, in large part, hers. But there was an absence in the mansion that no amount of building could fill. Milton and Catherine Hershey had no children, and it was, by the plain testimony of those who knew them, the great disappointment of both their lives. They had a fortune and a town and a marriage that observers called happy, and no son or daughter to give any of it to. The nursery and the house on the hill stayed empty. It is the fact around which everything else in this story finally turns. And then, early in the marriage, Kitty began to fail. She was struck by a progressive disease of the nervous system that no doctor of the age could fully name. A creeping paralysis that slowly took her balance and her mobility, and in time, even her ability to feel heat and cold against her own skin. By about 1912, she could no longer walk without difficulty. She bore it with a courage that everyone around her remarked upon. She went on traveling and shopping and buying her impossible hats, and she arranged her life with great care so that her infirmity would never make anyone else uncomfortable. She was very plucky, a contemporary remembered, and never made you feel uncomfortable about it. In the winter of 1911, the Hersheys went abroad, in part to seek some relief for Kitty's health, and there they booked their passage home aboard the newest and grandest ship in the world. Milton Hershey paid a 10% deposit to hold a stateroom on the maiden voyage of the Titanic. In the early spring, his business in Pennsylvania called him back sooner than the great liner would sail, and he canceled the booking and crossed instead on a German steamer, the America, reaching New York some days ahead of the ship he had been meant to take. The most famous disaster of the century missed the Hersheys by a matter of days. The quieter one was already aboard and had been for years. It was in this period, as her own time visibly shortened, that Catherine turned her husband toward the act that would define them both. The idea of a home and a school for orphan boys was hers, When anyone later asked Milton why he had founded it, he gave the same flat answer every time. It was Kitty's idea. On the 15th of November, 1909, the two of them signed the deed of trust together, establishing a school for healthy orphan boys whose fathers had died. Catherine shaped its earliest life directly, choosing the boys' meals and clothing and manners, and as her illness made public appearances harder, she had the boys brought up to High Point for breakfast once a year, so that she could see with her own eyes that they were being cared for as she wished. The childless couple had begun, quietly, to make heirs of other people's sons. She did not live to see what it would become. In March of 1915, returning from Atlantic City with a nurse and a companion, Catherine asked that the car windows be left open so she could feel the air on her face, and the March chill settled into her chest as pneumonia. They got her only as far as the Bellevue Stratford Hotel in Philadelphia. Milton was sent for and came at once. Knowing the end was near, Kitty sent him out of the room for a glass of champagne, so that he would not be beside her when she went. She died on the 25th of March, 1915. She was 43. Milton Hershey would never remarry, and he would never, by any account anyone left behind, recover. He had built a town for thousands, and could not keep the one person he had built it beside. What he did next would put his name on front pages across the country, though not for another 3 years, and not until he had made certain that no one alive could ever undo it. Grief did not soften Milton Hershey so much as concentrate him. After Kitty died, the school they had founded together became the nearest thing he had to a family. The home on his own birthplace farm, where the orphan boys lived and learned, stood in for the children he and Catherine had never been able to have. He visited them. He was photographed among them, a stout and aging man in a dark suit holding a 4-year-old boy on his knee. And in the years after her death, he turned the whole of his attention to a single question: what would happen to all of it when he was gone? He had no son to leave it to. He had instead the idea that Catherine had given him, and a fixed determination that it should outlast them both. In the autumn of 1918, the occasion arrived inside an ordinary piece of business. Hershey had built sugar mills and a railway down in Cuba to secure his own supply of sugar, and to finance that expansion, the Hershey Chocolate Company called a special meeting of its shareholders on the 12th of November to enlarge its capital stock. The day after that meeting, on the 13th of November, 1918, Milton Hershey quietly signed away the bulk of his fortune. He placed his controlling block of Hershey Chocolate Company stock into the Hershey Trust, to be held for one purpose and one purpose only: the support, in perpetuity, of the school for orphan boys. He had, in plain effect, given his company to the children, and the very restructuring that made the gift possible was financing a second empire entirely. In the year after Catherine's death, Hershey had begun buying land in Cuba, at first to secure the sugar that the war in Europe had made scarce, and then, increasingly, because the lush green island had become his refuge from grief. What began as a supply line turned into a mirror of everything he had raised in Pennsylvania. He built a flagship mill and a model town, and named it, inevitably, Central Hershey. Comfortable homes, a hospital, free schools, a golf course, a general store, and an all-electric railway, completed in 1922, that ran the length of the coast between Havana and Matanzas. At its height, the Cuban operation covered 60,000 acres, with 5 sugar mills, 4 power plants, and 251 miles of track. And in 1923, near one of those mills, he would found a second orphan school, its first pupils the children left fatherless by a head-on collision on his own railway that killed 25 people. The man who could not produce a single heir was, in these same years, building 2 kingdoms and 2 homes for other men's fatherless sons. The scale of it was difficult to grasp even at the time. When the newspapers finally assembled the story, they fixed the value of the gift at $60 million, a sum, his biographer has noted, more than double the $25 million for which the Coca-Cola Company had recently changed hands. It made the Hershey Industrial School the controlling owner of one of the largest confectionery companies on earth, the majority landowner of Derry Township, and the eventual heir to the streets, the houses, the trolley, the bank, and the park. The orphan boys on the hill now owned in trust the town spread out below them, and Milton Hershey told no one. He did not announce the gift, and he did not advertise it, and for 5 years almost no one beyond his own circle knew that it had happened. His reasons were characteristic of the man. To trumpet such a thing, he said, would have looked like an industrialist urging the public to eat more chocolate for the sake of orphans, and his competitors would have accused him of turning charity to profit. To Milton Hershey, who had spent his entire life as a man of business, the largest act of philanthropy of that life was, by his own description, simply another business decision. He had solved a problem. He saw no particular reason to discuss it. The silence broke in November of 1923. A reporter assembled the story. The Harrisburg papers ran it first, and on the 9th of November, the New York Times carried it to the country under a headline announcing that a Pennsylvania chocolate manufacturer had transferred his entire wealth to an orphanage. 9 days later, the Times gave him a full page, with photographs and his own words. One magazine ran a rare picture of the Chocolate King with the boys, a 4-year-old balanced on his lap, and the papers, doing the arithmetic the modest old man had never bothered to do aloud, began to call the children of Hershey the richest orphans in America. He was 66 years old, and he spoke of the matter without ornament. "I have no heirs, that is, no children," he said, "so I have decided to make the orphan boys of the United States my heirs." It was the sentence that would follow him to his grave and be carved, in spirit, into the marble of the place. A childless man had made the nation's orphans his inheritors and handed them a chocolate empire to grow up on. But the arrangement Hershey had constructed was stranger and harder than its tenderness suggested, and its hardness would stay invisible for years. By binding the school's survival to the company's stock, he had tied the welfare of the orphans to the profits of the plant, and the profits of the plant depended, as profits always do, on what the company paid the people who worked inside it. The dividends that clothed and fed and schooled the boys on the hill were the very same dividends that the wages along Chocolate Avenue, kept steady and kept low, helped to produce. Every dollar a worker might one day demand for himself was, in the cold arithmetic of the trust, a dollar withheld from an orphan. Hershey had not designed the thing as a weapon, but a weapon was what it could become, in the right season, in the right hands. For now, none of that was spoken aloud. The gift was a marvel, and the country received it as one, and the old man went on running in time, from a windowless limestone office on Chocolate Avenue, a fortune that belonged, on paper, to children. He had made the town's future permanent and very nearly unbreakable. He had also made every man and woman who labored in it, without ever quite saying so, a servant of the orphans on the hill. How that service was secured, house by house, wage by wage, in the daily machinery of the most thoroughly governed town in America, is the next part of the story. To understand how the gift became a grip, it is necessary to see the town as its founder saw it. Milton Hershey, his biographer writes, regarded the town and the factory as a single project, not a factory with a town attached, but one organism with two faces. The men and women who lived on Cocoa Avenue were the same men and women who stood at the conching machines on Chocolate Avenue, and so the comforts of the town were, in the final accounting, employee benefits, provided by the company, paid for by the company, and revocable by the company. The paved street and the good school and the band concert in the park were not the rights of citizens. They were the perquisites of employees in good standing. This was possible because Hershey, Pennsylvania, was never, in the ordinary sense, a town at all. It was never incorporated. It had no mayor, no borough council, no independent municipal government of its own, and it required none, because the company performed every function a government performs. When the streets wanted lighting, the company lit them. When the sidewalks cracked, the company repaired them. When a question of zoning arose, the company settled it. There was no ballot to cast and no official to petition, because there was no public office that the company did not already privately hold. In most American towns, authority was a thing the people granted and could take back. In Hershey, authority was simply a department of the firm, and the firm was very nearly everything. By the time the structure reached its mature form, in the years after the company's stock went public on the New York Exchange in 1927, the non-chocolate side of Milton Hershey's empire had been gathered into a single holding company that oversaw some 33 separate enterprises, running, as one history of the operation put it, the whole alphabet from abattoir to zoo, and the whole arc of a human life from Hershey Hospital to Hershey Cemetery. The water in the tap was the company's. The current in the wires was the company's. The telephone exchange, the trolley line, the department store, the bank that held the savings and wrote the mortgage, the newspaper that printed the news, the 5 churches, the 2 schools, the free library, the fire company, the amusement park, the zoo, even the professional hockey club, all of it traced by one thread or another back to the same man on the same hill. A resident of Hershey could be born in a Hershey hospital, taught in a Hershey school, hired at a Hershey plant, housed in a Hershey house, lit by Hershey power, and washed in Hershey water, entertained at a Hershey park, his wages kept in a Hershey bank, and at the last laid in a Hershey grave, and at no point in that entire passage step once beyond the reach of the company whose name he wore. We had a Hershey Water Company, one resident, the daughter of a machine shop man, would remember, a Hershey Electric Company, a Hershey Phone Company. What that totality meant in the daily life of a working family was that everything rested on a single condition, staying in the company's favor. Hiring and firing in Hershey were not matters of fixed policy so much as of relationship, decided by personal standing and individual favor, so that a man's livelihood could turn on whether the right people thought well of him. And because the job carried the house, and the house sat on the company's street, and the children attended the company's school, and the family's small savings sat in the company's vault. To lose the company's good opinion was not merely to lose a paycheck, it was to lose the ground one stood on. The oversight reached into private lives, into how a man kept his home and carried himself and what he was known to say, because in a place where the employer was also the landlord, the banker, the grocer, and the government, there was no private life the company did not, in some measure, hold. Above all of it stood High Point, the mansion Catherine had not lived to grow old in, and within it, the widower who had built the entire machine. Milton Hershey could be warm, and he could be, by the accounts of those who studied him closely, cold and domineering as well. And the conviction at the center of him was simple and total. He had given his workers everything, and a man who has given everything believes, with the full force of a clean conscience, that he is owed everything in return. The company towns of the popular imagination ruled their people by debt, by the long account at the company store that a miner could never quite pay down, that took his soul along with his wages. Hershey ruled his by the opposite instrument. He ruled by the gift. But a gift, given on that scale and never once allowed to be forgotten, builds a debt of its own, and a debt of gratitude is the harder of the two to discharge, because it carries no fixed sum and can never, by any payment, be marked paid in full. In fairness to the man, his was the most open-handed company town of its kind. Unlike George Pullman, who labored to keep his workers penned inside his fences, Hershey subsidized the very trolley that let his people ride out of his town to live or to shop wherever they liked. The benevolence was genuine, and so was the affection that many residents carried for him to the end of their lives. But the genuineness was precisely the trap. It is one thing to organize against a tyrant where the grievance is plain and the enemy is obvious. It is another thing altogether to organize against a benefactor, to demand more from a man who has already given more than any employer in America, and to do it in a town that will stand and watch. A worker in Hershey who reached for a union reached, in the eyes of his neighbors, for ingratitude. And ingratitude in a town founded upon gratitude was the one unforgivable sin. For 3 decades the arrangement held, because the town kept growing and the chocolate kept selling and the work never stopped, and a man whose family is fed and housed and schooled does not often pause to weigh what his gratitude is costing him. As long as the bargain paid, there was no need to name its terms. The terms would be named only when the bargain broke. And the bargain would break in the one place that no one in Hershey, Pennsylvania, had ever imagined the world could reach them, in the ledgers of the company itself, on the day the country could no longer afford even a 5-cent bar. By the time the bargain reached its height, the chocolate had conquered the country. Through the 1920s, the 5-cent bar and the small foil-wrapped kisses moved out of Hershey, Pennsylvania, by the trainload, into every general store and drugstore and crossroads counter in America, and by the end of the decade, the plant on Chocolate Avenue was the largest producer of milk chocolate in the world. In 1927, the company's stock was listed on the New York Exchange, and the town below the mansion stood at its zenith, prosperous, ordered, admired, and sure of itself. It was, by the common verdict of the age, the sweetest place in the country to be a working man. And then the country fell apart. The crash of 1929 emptied factories and broke company towns across the United States. Mill villages went dark, and the men who had depended on a single employer discovered, when that employer failed, that they had depended on nothing at all. In Hershey, the story was different, or so for much of the country it appeared. While other industrialists laid men off by the thousand, Milton Hershey did the opposite, on a principle the town would repeat for generations, that the surest way out of a depression was to give people work. Rather than discharge the men he could no longer keep busy making chocolate, he set them to building. One story captures the whole of it. When engineers brought steam shovels to dig the foundations of his new hotel, machines that could each do the labor of dozens of men, Hershey is said to have waved them off. "These machines do the work of 40 men," he told them. "Take them off. Hire 40 men." Through the hardest years of the Depression, he kept some 600 of them at work, raising the monuments that still define the town today. The list of what they built in those lean years would have been remarkable in a boom. Work began in 1932 on the Hotel Hershey, a Spanish-styled palace set atop a rise called Pat's Hill, and it opened the following spring in 1933. Its circular dining room was laid out, on Mr. Hershey's own instruction, so that every table held a good view and no guest was ever seated in a corner. That same year, hometown laborers completed the community building, a great limestone palazzo housing a library, a small hospital, dormitories, and the ornate Hershey Theater. In 1934, they raised Catherine Hall, the high school named for his late wife. And in 1935, the Chocolate Corporation moved into a new headquarters on Chocolate Avenue, a windowless block of locally quarried limestone, sealed and climate-controlled, a design the old man had seized upon mid-construction for its sheer efficiency. In 1936 came the Hershey Sports Arena, its vast barrel-shell roof an engineering marvel of its day, seating more than 7,000. And in 1939, the stadium. While much of America stood in bread lines, the sweetest town in the country built itself a hotel, a theater, and an arena. The contrast made Hershey famous, as other towns boarded their windows. Magazines and newsreels held the chocolate town up as living proof that a benevolent capitalism could weather any storm, and tourists arrived by the thousands to walk its clean streets, ride its park, and marvel at a place the Depression seemed to have simply forgotten. The fame was deserved. It was also a kind of camouflage. The visitor who admired the rising hotel did not see the shortened paycheck behind it, and the worker who lived on that shortened paycheck stood and watched the visitor admire the hotel. But the monuments cast a long shadow, and in that shadow the company's ledgers told a second and harder story. The Depression had cut the firm's revenues in half. The men who had been accustomed, before the crash, to a 60-hour week now found themselves held to 40, and on a 40-hour paycheck in those years, a good many of them could no longer make ends meet. The annual bonuses that had quietly softened the whole arrangement stopped coming. And here the numbers turn cold. Between 1930 and 1936, Milton Hershey spent more than $10 million building up his town. And in those very same 6 years, with the men's hours cut and their bonuses gone, the Hershey Chocolate Corporation earned more than $37 million in profit after taxes. The hotel rose on the hill while the paychecks shrank in the valley. To the men on the line, the contradiction was not an abstraction. The munificence and the squeeze were not two separate policies, but one. The building campaign was, in plain effect, the wage policy. Instead of paying his chocolate workers more for making chocolate, Hershey paid them, at reduced hours, to build him a hotel and an arena and a windowless office. And a man, however grateful, cannot feed his children on a band shell or pay his rent with a hockey rink. The gifts were genuine. But they were the company's gifts, chosen by the company and raised to the company's glory, and a worker watching the Hotel Hershey climb the slope of Pat's Hill while his own hours fell away beneath him could be forgiven for asking, under his breath, who all of this abundance was finally for. There was, too, a distance opening at the very top that the men on the line could feel but could not quite name. Milton Hershey was, by the middle of the decade, an old man, nearing 80, increasingly deaf, and spending more and more of the year on his sugar estates down in Cuba, far from the factory floor. The benevolent founder of the town's mythology was, in daily fact, a figure receding from it, and the corporation that cut the hours and stopped the bonuses was run by executives, chief among them its president, William Murray, a capable and hard-headed company man with no sentimental attachment to the bargain Hershey had struck. This was the quiet trap folded inside the whole arrangement. A worker could not carry his grievance up the hill to the kindly old man because the old man was in Havana, and the decisions were no longer his to make in any case. He had to carry it instead to a company, and a company, unlike a benefactor, can be argued with, organized against, and struck. For a time, the squeeze wore the cover of law. Under the National Recovery Administration, the federal recovery program of the early New Deal, the company's tight hold on hours and wages was simply what the government required, and a worker's resentment had nowhere obvious to land. But in 1935, the Supreme Court struck the National Recovery Administration down as unconstitutional, and the cover fell away. What had been a federal rule now stood revealed, to the men on the line, as a company choice. The choice to keep their hours short and their bonuses gone while the corporation raised palaces and counted its millions. For the first time in 30 years, the gratitude that had held Hershey together began to curdle into a question. And a question, once it has been asked aloud, is very difficult to unask. The question needed only a voice to give it words. In the last weeks of 1936, in the world's sweetest town, it found one, not in a speech or a sermon or a hall full of men, but in a single mimeographed sheet of paper that began to pass, quietly, from hand to hand, along the line. The sheet of paper had a name. It was called the Chocolate Bar Bee, a crude mimeographed bulletin that began circulating through the factory in the closing weeks of 1936, and it said aloud what the model town did not permit its workers to say. It described the work as it actually was, and it set that grinding reality against the polished image the town presented to the world. Chocolate making was hot, heavy, punishing labor, and the bulletin scorned the company's big bosses, Murray and Hershey, for what it called their high salaries and slave-driving methods. And at the foot of the page, in the town that Milton Hershey had built as the kindly answer to industrial misery, the bulletin was signed by the Communist Party of Hershey, Pennsylvania. That signature alone would have been astonishing, a red leaflet passing through the streets of Chocolate Town, but it was a symptom and not a cause. The cause was the squeeze, the shortened hours, the vanished bonuses, the paychecks that no longer stretched to the end of the week, and the slow recognition, spreading along the line, that the abundance everyone could see going up around them was not flowing in their direction. The Chocolate Bar Bee did not invent the grievance. It only gave the grievance a voice and told the men what to do with it. Organize. They were not alone in the country. 1937 was the great year of American labor's revolt, the year the new Congress of Industrial Organizations swept through the nation's factories, and the sit-down strike, in which workers occupied the plant rather than walking out of it, became the weapon of the age. That winter, auto workers had seized the General Motors plants at Flint, Michigan, and held them through the cold until the largest car maker in the world agreed to recognize their union. By spring, the tactic had spread to scores of industries and hundreds of thousands of workers, and it was moving toward central Pennsylvania. It reached Hershey in January when organizers from the CIO called a secret meeting at a firehouse in Palmyra, the next town down the trolley line. They met in Palmyra because there was nowhere in Hershey itself to gather beyond the company's reach. Out of that meeting came a local of the United Chocolate Workers Union, and within weeks, several hundred Hershey workers had signed their names to it, an act that, in that town, required a particular kind of nerve, because to join the union was to be marked, in the eyes of every loyal neighbor, as an ingrate. At first, and remarkably, it seemed to work without a fight. When the new union approached the company to bargain, it met little resistance. The corporation agreed to raise wages to 60 cents an hour for the men and 45 cents an hour for the women. It looked, for a few weeks in the early spring of 1937, as though the model town might simply absorb the union the way it had absorbed everything else, and the whole matter might end in a handshake. It did not. Soon after the agreement, the company laid off a number of the union's organizers, which its president, William Murray, explained as ordinary seasonal cutbacks. The union did not believe him. The March agreement, the organizers insisted, had promised job security to the very men now being let go, and the layoffs looked like precisely what unions in that era had every reason to dread: the quiet dismantling of the local, one organizer at a time, under the cover of the calendar. Whatever Murray's true intent, the effect was to destroy what little trust the handshake had built. The men who had reached, against the whole weight of the town's disapproval, for a union now believed the company meant to break it before it could draw a breath. On the 1st of April, 1937, the union gathered once more in the Palmyra firehouse to decide what to do. They chose the thing the age had made famous. They would not walk out and surrender the plant to the company's hands. They would sit down inside it, occupy the machines, and stop the chocolate at its source until the company agreed to bargain in earnest. It was a calculated act, and it carried a calculated risk, for to sit down inside another man's factory was to dare the town and the law and the founder himself to come and put them out. The next morning, the 2nd of April, the men came to work as they always did, and waited. At 11 o'clock, on the pavement outside the factory on Chocolate Avenue, the union's president, a powerfully built man named Russell Behrman, whom everyone called Bull, raised a red handkerchief above his head and waved it once. It was the signal they had agreed upon, and in a matter of minutes, all across the great plant that Milton Hershey had built, the machines fell silent. For the first few days, it looked almost like a holiday. When the machines stopped on the 2nd of April, the strikers took possession of the plant with a discipline that surprised everyone, themselves included. Some sat down at their own posts, others picketed the sidewalks of Chocolate Avenue, and hundreds, in the image that gave the next morning's headline, climbed up and settled onto the roofs of the long factory buildings, looking down over the town in the spring sun. They ran the occupation like a careful household. A union kitchen sent in food. The men organized themselves into shifts, so the buildings were never left unheld. They set up cameras to prove they were damaging nothing of Mr. Hershey's, and they forbade smoking in the rooms where chocolate was made. Over the highest building, in the place where the American flag usually flew, they ran up the banner of the CIO. The mood inside was light. One striker described the whole affair as more like a family squabble than an angry revolution. It was not a family squabble, because the head of the family was not there. Milton Hershey was an old man by then, dividing his year between Cuba and Pennsylvania, and the strikers were not facing him. They were facing William Murray, the company's hard-headed president, who had no patience for unions and no intention of negotiating with men who had seized his factory. Murray's answer was simple and immovable. The company would not bargain at all until the strikers walked out of the plant. And so the sit-down hardened into a siege, and the lightness of the first days began, hour by hour, to cool. What the strikers had not reckoned with was the town. The chocolate factory employed some 3,000 workers, and the larger corporation nearly 2,000 more across its other arms, and the overwhelming majority of them wanted no part of the strike. It was never even settled how many men actually sat down, the organizers claiming 1,200 and the company's executives insisting on 400. But the fiercest opposition came from beyond the factory gates altogether, from the thousands of dairy farmers spread across the surrounding countryside whose milk the Hershey plant bought by the tank car. With the creamery shut, that milk had nowhere to go. Every single day the strike continued, the farmers of the region were left with some 800,000 pounds of milk, enough to supply a city of 1 million people souring in the cans with no buyer. To those families, the men on the rooftops were not striking a corporation. They were pouring the county's livelihood into the gutter. And here, the deepest strangeness of Milton Hershey's creation came due. The men inside the plant believed they were striking a company. The town outside knew them as striking a family, and as something worse than that. For the plant they had stopped was owned through the trust by the orphan boys on the hill. Its profits were the orphans' bread, and the milk it bought was the farmer's wage, and the very abundance the strikers resented carried 1,000 dependents who were not the company at all. To the loyal worker and the ruined dairyman, these were not laborers pressing a fair grievance. They were ingrates against a benefactor, thieves against orphans, and the men who were bleeding the whole valley dry. Milton Hershey had built a town in which there was no neutral ground to stand on, and now, in its first true crisis, every loyalty in it ran in a single direction against the handful of men who had dared to sit down. There was, in the middle of it, a moment of plain decency that the situation then turned into a weapon. On the 5th of April, the 4th day, a delegation of the desperate farmers came in to talk with the strikers, and the strikers agreed to help them, offering to run the factory's creamery themselves, so that the farmers' milk could at least be processed and saved. It was a generous gesture from men who stood to gain little by it. The next day, the company's milkmen did not come to collect the milk. Whatever the reason, the effect was to leave the cans to spoil and the farmers to face ruin, and to aim that ruin squarely at the men inside the plant. By the evening of the 6th of April, several thousand loyal workers and farmers were marching through the streets of Palmyra in support of the Hershey Chocolate Corporation. By 11 o'clock the following morning, the 7th of April, more than 3,000 of them had massed outside the factory, and they handed the strikers an ultimatum: leave the plant by 1 o'clock or be put out by force. And then came the part that no one afterward could ever quite explain, for the crisis appeared in that final hour to be ending peacefully. Murray and the union's own leaders, Bull Bayman and John Loy, had already agreed to end the strike. The leaders had asked Murray to step in and keep the peace. The thing seemed, for a moment, to be over without a blow being struck. It was not over. For reasons that were never afterward established, men began to peel away from the rally, snatching up baseball bats and billy clubs and hammers, and ran toward the factory, and within minutes there were thousands of them at the doors. Insults passed between the crowd outside and the strikers within, and then the mob, outnumbering the men inside roughly 4-to-1, broke into the plant. Dozens were hurt in the rooms and the corridors. The crowd singled out the 3 leaders. Bull Bayman, John Loy, and the CIO organizer Miles Sweeney were beaten severely. Sweeney was struck down with a baseball bat, Loy lost several of his teeth, and stones were thrown after the 3 of them as they were driven. bleeding from the building. A New York newspaper, reaching for the town's own gentle register, called it the indignity, not to say the physical pain, of an old-fashioned walloping, administered by farmers who then went home, that same afternoon, to tend their fields and their cows. The model town had broken its strike not with the company's hired guns and not with the state police, but with its own bare hands. The reaction beyond Hershey was immediate. Governor George Earl of Pennsylvania called the affair a disgrace and laid the blame on the Derry Township Sheriff for standing aside while the MRB forced the doors. And the old man at the center of it all was, by the accounts of those near him, privately and deeply shaken. He had raised a whole town to stand as the proof that benevolence could purchase peace, and his own grateful people, defending his own gift, had beaten his other people bloody on the floor of his own factory. The strike was broken, but the question it had asked could not be unasked, and the picture of it would cling to the model town for the rest of its days. What happened next, in the elections that followed, and in the long, strange afterlife of the fortune, would answer the only question that finally mattered. Whether the utopia had ever truly been a utopia at all, or only a very beautiful arrangement for ensuring that one man's gift could never be refused. The law came to Hershey after the bats had done their work. In the weeks following the riot, the National Labor Relations Board moved in, investigated the company, and ordered an election to settle, by ballot, what the mob had tried to settle by force. The result was a measure of how thoroughly the town still belonged to its founder. The chocolate workers voted, by a landslide, not for the CIO that had led them, but for a small loyalist outfit, the Independent Chocolate Workers of Hershey. Federal authorities ruled that the election had not been a free one and ordered another. And in 1939, in a second and fairer vote, the workers at last chose a genuine union affiliated with the American Federation of Labor and won a contract that brought them overtime pay, paid vacations, and a procedure for arbitrating their grievances. Hershey became one of the first candy companies in America to recognize a union. It was a victory, and it was a hollow one. A free union had finally come to the model town, but only after the town had risen up and beaten the men who first reached for it, and the memory of that spring did not fade. The press seized on the Hershey riot as proof that the sit-down strike was a menace to public order, and within 2 years the Supreme Court had ruled the tactic illegal altogether. The men of Hershey had won their union and lost the thing the town had always claimed to be. After the 7th of April, 1937, no one could honestly call Hershey, Pennsylvania, a model of anything. It was simply a company town, like the others, that had shown the country what it would do when it was crossed. Milton Hershey lived 8 more years. He went on investing in the town, went on receiving the accolades of a grateful public, and went on, in private, carrying the wound of what his people had done. He retired from the company's board in 1944, an old man nearing 90, profoundly deaf, the last of his line. On the 13th of October 1945, he died in the Hershey Hospital he had built, in the town that bore his name, having outlived his wife by 30 years and fathered no child to mourn him. Years afterward, his old students raised a bronze statue of him in the rotunda of the school, and beneath it they set the words by which the town still chooses to remember him. His deeds are his monument, his life our inspiration. And the deeds did endure on a scale that would have astonished even their author. The orphan boys he had made his heirs inherited, and the inheritance only grew. The Milton Hershey School Trust, the vehicle into which he quietly poured his fortune in 1918, has in recent years held assets of roughly $17 billion, and through a special class of stock, it commands close to 80% of the voting power of the Hershey Company, making the maker of the 5-cent bar very nearly the only corporation among the Fortune 500 that is controlled outright by a charity. The same trust owns, in full, the company that runs the Hotel Hershey and the amusement park and the resorts. The school that opened to its first 4 orphan boys in a farmhouse in 1910 now educates more than 2,000 children at a time, of every background, entirely free of charge. A childless couple's answer to an empty nursery had become one of the wealthiest schools on earth. But the gift had succeeded so completely that its very success became a kind of problem and a fitting final irony. Milton Hershey's deed had directed that the fortune endure in perpetuity, which the trustees came to read as a command to spend only the income the endowment threw off, and never to touch the principal beneath it. And so the richest school in America came to sit atop billions of dollars that its own founder had forbidden it to give away. Twice the courts have had to reach into a dead man's wishes. In 1963, they allowed the trust to divert some $50 million to found what became the Penn State Milton S. Hershey Medical Center. And in 2002, when the trustees moved to sell their controlling stake in the chocolate company itself to cash out the orphans' inheritance for as much as $12 billion, the people of Pennsylvania rose against it. The state's attorney general went to court, and the sale was stopped. The orphan's fortune had grown so vast that the law was now needed to protect it from the very men charged with keeping it. It was the gift's own logic carried to its end, a benevolence so total that it could no longer be entrusted even to its trustees. Of the 2 towns Milton Hershey built, only one kept its bargain. The Pennsylvania town thrives, a place of museums and roller coasters, and a school still feeding its children. The Cuban town did not. After the Revolution of 1959, Central Hershey was stripped of its founder's name and rechristened for a young guerrilla of Fidel Castro's. Its great mill fell silent at last in 2002 and stands today a rusting iron skeleton on a hilltop, while the old electric railway he laid still creeps along its tracks, carrying the occasional passenger past the ruin of the second utopia. 2 monuments to the same restless vision, one a living school, the other a ghost. And underneath all of it, beneath the $17 billion and the controlling shares and the thousands of cared-for children, lay the same small absence from which the whole vast edifice had grown, the child that Milton and Catherine Hershey were never able to have. In his last deaf and solitary years, the old man would have himself driven out from the great empty mansion to the town's gardens, where the roses that had once been Kitty's still bloomed, transplanted and tended long after her death, and there he would sit among them. He had built a fortune that outlived everyone it was meant for, and a town that would carry his name for as long as the country lasted, and a school that would go on making children of strangers his heirs into a future he could not begin to picture. He had built, in the end, everything except the one thing he had wanted, and all the rest of it was only what a grieving man had done with the love he had nowhere else to put. His deeds were his monument. The empty nursery was the rest of the truth. The story of Hershey, Pennsylvania, is one of many in which an American fortune built a world and then revealed its price. Empire of Acres will go on tracing these dynasties and the places they made and unmade, the boom towns and the company towns, the estates and the empires, the families whose gifts and ruins still shape the map. For anyone who wishes to follow that work, please like and subscribe. And in the gardens above Chocolate Avenue, the roses still bloom, tended for a woman gone more than a century, which may be the truest monument of all.